Hi, welcome to part 2 of the Kritik lecture. During this particular lecture, we're going to identify different critiques by looking at some of the terms that are used. We're going to also talk about topic-specific criticisms, including the abolition criticism, and then we're going to talk about non-traditional debate. So to begin, let's talk about two critical terms that exist that everyone should know. First is epistemology. And epistemology is the study of knowledge and justified belief. It examines the way that we actually come to know what we consider to be truth, which often means that that truth or that perspective is our own subjective view of the world. The Matrix is a great example of epistemology. The character Neo spends most of his day plugged into a computer screen, not realizing that he is part of a larger system that exists. He believes he understands how the world operates and that he has full control to a certain extent over the things that happen. But, spoiler alert, he comes to discover that the world around him is not something that he could actually prove is real. And when the layer of reality is pulled back, he finds out he's simply stuck within a simulation. He's stuck within kind of a program that writes ways for him to understand or orient himself in the world. Debating epistemology works the same way. We have to pull back the layer of reality that the affirmative says exists in the plan and in the advantages. Because if you remember from part 1 of this lecture, assumptions will tell us that the resolution is based on a set of beliefs or truths. The plan is based on a set of beliefs or truths, and so are the advantages. Which means that if you follow the logical train of the F, there's got to be inconsistency somewhere depending on the perspective that you have. Epistemology is all about understanding what the knowledge and justified belief of the affirmative is and pointing out the flaws in that belief based on historical examples or philosophical challenges. The second term is ontology, or the study of being. Ontology is something you're going to hear a lot this year because race is often a subject where ontologized individuals exist. Ontology examines the relation of human beings to their world around them. And I say that in that way because although race, gender, sexual orientation, ability, most categories we know are social constructs, those social constructs have real and tangible effects. They have real codified punishment, and we should take that into consideration when thinking about the way that we have conversation about those individual things. So ontology does that because it says, what is the relationship that you have or that the affirmative has in this instance to certain discussions? My opinion is that the entire resolution is a conversation about criminality. Now, most people's relationship to criminality is that, to be a criminal means to be imprisoned, and to not be imprisoned, therefore, means you're not a criminal, so you're free. And we often romanticize the binary relationship of freedom versus criminality, or freedom from criminality, which is a very interesting concept. I want you for a second to think about this. Have you ever eaten a piece of candy out of the grocery store without paying for it? Have you ever taken something from a friend? Something innocent, a pen or a pencil. Have you ever eaten a grape without paying for it? Some people take the hot sauce bottle at Chipotle. All of these qualify as acts of criminality, but we celebrate them when we see our friends do it. No one criminalizes a child for eating a piece of candy out of a store or eating a grape off of a vine in a grocery store. Several of us break the speed limit every single day when we drive. We go 1 mile over. Remember, because speed limit means the fastest that you're supposed to go. It's not the floor, but it's the ceiling. And we celebrate it. We get in cars with people all the time that don't wear seatbelts. All of those are criminal acts. They're breaking the law. But we romanticize the idea of freedom based on our orientation. 2, those particular laws are that act of criminality. Now, that's not an attempt to say that violent crimes are good, but it is an attempt to say that we have a relationship with criminality and it's all different. Perspective dominates and determines how we orient ourselves towards it. Ontology would simply say that some people's relationality to criminality is different than others. And in fact, some people only have a relationality to criminality and not a relationality to freedom. So debate helps us to challenge those views, helps us to challenge those relations, whether they're present in the affirmative or whether they're present in the performance or whether they're just present in debate. A great example is if I were to ask you right now, do criminals belong in prisons or in jail? Most people would say yes. But if I took that question and I peeled a layer back and we kind of pushed the rewind button and I asked you instead, when does a criminal stop being a criminal? Most people wouldn't have an answer to that. Because it's a difficult question to answer, which is why people that have been to prison never escape the stigma. Because our orientation, our relationship to criminality in the United States, in this world, right, is only understood through that context. The K will attempt to expose you to new realities and new ways to think about it and challenge you not to have that perspective. Some other debate terms, which if you watch part 1, you've heard all of these already. We talked about them. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over this portion again, but I do think it's important to identify that these are 5 fundamental terms that you will see in debates or hear in debates that your opponent will make. If you hear these things being said, you are debating a criticism. Even if they don't say it's a criticism, it's a K. Trust me, these terms are directly tied to debating criticisms. And you should make sure now that you prioritize thinking about the type of argument or the type of philosophy that it is. So let's talk about some topic-specific criticisms. Here's a quick overview of topic-specific criticisms that you can hear. The abolition K, which we'll talk about in detail. Anti-Blackness, which we'll briefly cover. Afrofuturism, again, briefly cover. Queer theory. We're going to talk about 2 different types of thought, kind of trains of thought, schools of thought that exist for queer theory, as well as settler colonialism, biopower, and capitalism. Critical legal studies is a very fascinating argument, and I am still kind of compiling a lot of different perspectives to have on that, specifically surrounding critical race theory in the context of criminal justice reform. But I wanted to point out to you that it is a school of thought that exists that might be worth looking into. You might hear arguments that relate directly to it, and some of those arguments might be attached to the larger theoretical arguments like anti-Blackness and queer theory that I've already talked about earlier. So let's get right into it. First up is anti-Blackness and Afro-pessimism. Afro-pessimism problematizes the attempt to find meaning and political change in a world that is already defined by anti-Blackness. And when we say anti-Blackness, the easiest way for us to attempt to bring you to the register of what that means is, if you were a slave, would you want the plantation to be reformed or would you want the plantation to be destroyed? The if you were a slave question requires you to understand the historical weight of what it meant to be a slave. Most people use Frank Wilderson, who's pictured here, and he's been popularized in order to understand kind of the slave as a position, not the slave as a kind of an adjective. It's a position. That position is wound up in ontological death. Now, you remember we talked about ontology earlier, which is a relation to the human being's relation to the world. Wilderson's and most Afro-pessimist positions believe that anti-Blackness requires that Black people to have an ontological position of death in the world. And they believe that based on three concepts. The first is natal alienation, or the ripping away of historical context of the life of a person, whether it's familial ties or anything else. It is that they have been removed from any register that allows them to track ancestry or to track lineage in a way that's useful, which means they lose access to culture, to language, to knowledge, and to family. The second one is general dishonor, which means Black people, whether they want to or not, represent all Black people. Let me say that in a different way for you. To be Black and see someone commit a crime, Black people often say, ugh, he making us all look bad. That's not generally something that other races do. It's also generally not a cultural practice of the way that we describe other races. No one says, oh, wow, look at that Latina guy. That's why you think all Latina people are evil. Or look at that Asian guy, and that's why all Asian people are evil. General dishonor says that Black people lack the capacity to be honorable beings, lack the capacity to be trusted. There's always the example known as the elevator example, in which a Black man dressed in street clothes can get into an elevator and experience the microaggression of the grasping of a purse as a woman moves away from him, or someone moving away from him in the elevator period, not to be near them because he's not trusted or she's not trusted. Another Black person dressed in a suit could get on the elevator and receive the same reaction. And the reason for that is because the mindset has been created that Black people are dangerous, that they're criminals, that they're animals. And all of those things are based on general dishonorment. The final one is gratuitous violence. The explanation of how extreme forms of violence are experienced by the slave, and in an analogy by Black people. I just read a very interesting article that talked about the relationship of dogs to policing and to slavery, and how they were used in order to literally rip the flesh from runaway slaves to discourage other slaves from running away. And dogs are still used in policing now as a form of control and scare tactic. Gratuitous violence is when you experience a level of violence that is so extreme that is unfathomable. And a great example when we're talking about impacts, and the way to categorize those impacts would be to have a discussion that would conclude with anyone that experiences a form of violence to be able to say, well, at least I'm not a slave. Because the slave becomes the foundation, but also the backdrop to the way that we understand all violence. And that's Wilderson's theory. The flip side to Afro-pessimism, of course, is Afrofuturism and optimism. These still fundamentally believe in the claim of anti-Blackness as violence existing on Black people, of ontologizing death onto Black folks, general dishonorment, and natal alienation. Those concepts are still consistent. But the conclusion takes a different flight, so to speak. It's about moving away from a desire to recognize how to end or resolve the world and moving to a different world, existing on a different plane, of thinking yourself out of the current situation that kind of dominates your life and instead finding alternative ways of survival. Two kind of Foundational authors, if you're interested in pursuing futurism or optimism, would be Octavia Butler or Sun Ra. And some rising stars that I found that are just, they have fantastic writing, whether it's fictional or not, is Cherie Thomas and Michael Carrington. Afrofuturism and optimism is all about discovering a different reality and a different world to exist in, playing around with science fiction in order to dream up new ways of policing, incarceration, or whatever else you want to have. Whereas pessimism, again, says the plantation is still alive and well, and we should simply end it. Next up is queer theory. Queer theory challenges the assumptions of social norms of binary gender and sexual orientations. It is concerned with advocating for the rights of LGBTQ plus individuals, LGBTQ plus identifying individuals in the criminal justice system, ranging from young people to sex workers to persecuted non-binary folks. There are two specific articles that kind of popped up that I think are absolutely fascinating and provide further context to this conversation. First is Queering Smart Decarceration by Jane Harith and Alita Boris. This particular article looks at how social workers are using their platforms to help LGBTQ plus individuals find ways to navigate the prison industrial complex. But it takes it a step further. And it says not only is it necessary for us to have the conversation that allows them to find ways to navigate that system, but social workers need to implement more of an abolitionist praxis in their discussions. This potentially could be a great perm argument or a great alternative argument for how we can get policy solutions, because the authors are looking for actual concrete ways of implementing abolition within social work in the context of LGBTQ plus youth. The next article is Queer Insecurity, and it's a very kind of easy, short read that is by Tali Ben Daniel and Hilary Barrick. And this article is phenomenal because it begins to get at how queering the world, or queering what we find as things we have to hold on to, our normative ideas and concepts, justify certain practices like policing, like incarceration, because it's all about disrupting and dispelling the fear around difference, which is what queering ultimately does. It challenges the idea of normalcy, and it says that normalcy requires an abnormal that is always policed, incarcerated, and killed. And we should move away from that. Next is settler colonialism. This one is also a very, very strong philosophical approach to having discussions about state-sanctioned power and state legitimacy. Settler colonialism challenges the concept of sovereignty, or ethical legitimacy of the United States, its citizens, and its ability to govern. It prioritizes recognizing how citizenship comes at the cost of stolen land and genocide, and that it continues to this day to perpetuate indigenous death. Two very interesting kind of perspectives to take. The first one is No Prisons on Stolen Land by Lisa Gunther. And this one actually has an interview by Lisa Gunther where she goes in detail describing how the audacity of a criminal system like the United States federal government to lock up other people for being violent and are non-submissive is absurd, because they also are violent and they're illegal. They have no ethical justification for being here because of the slaughter and absolute genocide of indigenous populations that were here before the formation of the United States. The second article is Beyond Safety and Refusing Colonial Violence Through Indigenous Feminist Planning by Heather Doris and Laura Harjo. This one takes an indigenous feminist perspective on how to better plan abolitionist movements, abolitionist strategy, and abolitionist tactics. It says that indigenous feminists have always been able to resist kind of the state, its alluring welcome, our integration, and its violent tendencies. And we need kind of fugitive practices like that. in order to be able to subvert the state's kind of an all-encompassing power through military or police force. Next up is biopower, which is an extremely popular topic as well. Biopower attempts to challenge the legitimacy of the state or state violence due to its required kind of connection to state-sanctioned violence, right? So the state can justify certain violent acts because it controls its citizens and it controls non-citizens. If you think about it, a great example would be the Patriot Act that was signed after 9/11. Several people thought it was a great idea because they felt attacked. They were willing to give up certain freedoms that they experienced as citizens to the state in order to feel safer. But the moment you give the state an inch, they'll take a mile. Spying on individuals, using different tactics to be able to kind of track statistically where crime happens, and then placing police force there. Transferring military-grade weapons from the military to local police. All of these things are ways that the state justifies itself and then perpetuates violence onto its citizenship. Two articles you can read if interested in that type of discussion is The Problematization as an Activist Practice, which is Reconsidering Foucault by Anna Trewell. And this one specifically deals with how activism hasn't gone far enough, that activism has to become more radical. It has to be much more focused on the end point of abolition, which is the removal of the state. Otherwise, the population, the citizens, in the word of Agamben, are just standing reserve. They're cannon fodder. They are waiting to be exterminated or sacrificed for the perpetuation or the survival of the state. The second article, well, actually the second kind of link here, and by the way, all of these are links that if you go to the actual PowerPoint on D2L, you can click on these and it will take you directly to the article, and they all should be downloadable. If not, contact me and I have them all saved and I can upload those for you as well. But life in prison, biopolitics, ill-being, and the neoliberal penitentiary by William McKeithen, is all about how prison itself is just an extension of governmental biopolitical power. That prison is a way for the government not only to remove you and all of your freedoms, but to further control and restrict your movement and your freedom. Some popular schools of thought that exist that we're not going to get into today because there's not enough time, but I think that you should be ready to discuss some of them, and we will actually have some additional activities that cover this too. Postmodernism, post-structuralism, and post-humanism. There are descriptions of what each one of those are in the notes of this lecture, and I'll let you review that. And if you have questions, those will be great questions to kind of bring to the discussion for us to continue to review and share with each other. Let's get to the thing you've been waiting for, the abolition K. It is the K that is currently in the decarceration neg, and it is the discussion that we have kind of started but haven't really dove into. So when we say abolition, what do we mean? Well, we say that the definition of it is an action or an act of abolishing a system, a practice, or an institution. And the criticism itself, or the way it's written, it asks us to kind of deal with, I think, three assumptions that really begin to get at the heart of what does prison and criminal justice really about. So the first one is reform equals progress. The second is law equals just. And the third one is caging humans equals okay. Let's go through each one of those and kind of figure out, how do we respond to those things? And how do we really have a conversation about what abolition is in the context of this particular topic? The first assumption is that reforms are just. Well, reforms are designed as changes to the system to correct past harms And that's important to remember. That the purpose of reforms is not to say that the entire system is broken, but that it just didn't understand a particular component, and therefore it must be addressed, which is why we make changes and not get rid of the system. The second one is order is needed to avoid chaos. The 9/11 example is prudent here. People gave away freedom in order to maintain order. Just think about COVID and how much people freaked out about having to wear a mask. Order being restored means that we have to allow people to do the things they want to do within a certain extent in order to avoid violence, in order to avoid destruction of property, in order to avoid conflict. And reforms do that, or at least they have done it historically. The last one is justice is only possible through an objective perspective. Now, if you look at that one, you may think, what does that one mean? Well, that one means that when you think about the affirmative, they have to pass something that's good for everyone because it's a federal policy generally. If it's state and local, that's a different debate, but still generally, policy indicates that all people, everything being equal, benefit from this thing. It has to, otherwise it violates certain kind of equal protections that are in place. So there are a few ways that you can answer kind of the first assumption, which is reforms are just, which also justify the 3 points underneath it. The first one is the time DA, that reforms aren't reforms, but remodeling. So a reform means one thing. It means that you change kind of the way that things have been done. You change them. Well, from every historical perspective you can think of for prisons, it's just been remodeling. They haven't changed the system. There was slavery in which they locked up Black people for simply trying to run away or be free. And even when they ended slavery during Reconstruction and they had crop sharing, then they would lock you up for kind of lingering or trespassing. Then it went on to Jim and Jane Crow. It's always been remodeling. The system hasn't changed. It's continued to simply put on different outfits to make itself seem more acceptable. And the time dissad would say that that continual process of remodeling doesn't change the nature of violence towards Black and brown bodies. It exacerbates it. It makes it more sophisticated. It makes it more justified. 846 is a number I want you to remember because it's a number that explains the amount of time that George Floyd, kind of the catalyst to this international movement of Black Lives Matter, had another person's knee on his neck before he passed. 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And even though people have seen it, you still have people who are saying it was a justified killing. Remember, the system hasn't changed. It's simply been remodeled. It's become more sophisticated. It's become easier to explain away harms and violence that exist. The second point is all of these debates are debates, or should, or at least all of these debates should be discussions of equity versus equality. The difference, now there's a substantial difference between equity and equality. And if you all need to discuss that, we can definitely discuss that, but this is what I'll leave you with. Order and objectivity assume equality, but not equity. I'll say that again. Order and objectivity assume equality, but not equity. To say that there is peace assumes that everyone is existing in the same type of mode, right? This goes back to ontology, that everyone's relationship to the world is the same, and it's not. The abolition K would say that order requires more than simply peace. It requires justice. It requires justice. Objectivity fails to understand ontology because objectivity says that there is no subjective position that exists. It can't be. It has to be about what we've set up for the world to experience. What happens when the world exists on you, but not for you? The second assumption is that law is just. And from that, we can derive three basic arguments that the affirmative may make. The first is that law rules the land by creating a standard everyone can follow. This is a little bit of that objectivity we talked about in assumption one. The second is that law is used to protect us by granting us all rights. Maybe. Third is law can be changed from time to time to increase access to society. Two responses. First is the legality dissent. Laws aren't used to protect people. They're used to justify state-sanctioned violence against the people. Remember, if we go back for a second and think of how I said that we have a romanticized relationship with freedom of criminality and criminality, which means that all of us to a certain extent break laws on a daily basis, probably. We all do something. If you watch something illegally on your computer, or you download something illegally, or like I said, if you break the speed limit, those are all criminal acts. They're all criminal acts. And most people allow them to happen. They think it's cool. They share movies and books and TV shows and music with their friends. Video games, I don't know if people still video games, but I assume they might. But if they do, that people share all those things. Those are acts of criminality. Because the problem is that law doesn't exist to protect people. It's not there to do that. It's there to say that there is a system in place that if something is violated, that the government has the authority to come in and implement punishment. That's what it's for. The second one is the power inversion dissent. Power inversion dissent. It says that laws don't shape societal norms. Laws actually bend to societal norms. I said this earlier when we had office hours, that when you look from a historical perspective for the civil rights movement, the Civil Rights Act wasn't passed because Martin Luther King was such a dynamic speaker that he got it passed. It was a convergence of things. Part of that convergence was that you had the nonviolent peaceful protest that was going on, but on the other side of that, you had militant Black groups that also existed that posed a particular problem for the government, because the national spotlight was on the nonviolent group, and then there would be quick images of the violent protests. The same thing's happening now. Most of the protests that exist right now are peaceful. They're peaceful. Then we had riots, and now all of a sudden, entire police departments are disappearing. Laws don't determine how kind of society is structured. That's probably the biggest assumption that affirmatives will have, that this criticism allows you to challenge. Society, people, the citizens determine how power operates in our particular society. And it's not just when Black folks revolt, or when people of color revolt, or when, insert group. It has to be a collective kind of critical mass movement. And you'll see some changes happen, which is why the abolition criticism potentially can resolve the act. The third assumption we'll talk about is the concept of punishment, or caging humans equals okay. The first thought is that people should be punished for committing crimes. The second one is that you give up your right to freedom when you break the law. And the third one is that prison equals serving your time and paying your debt to society. All of these have problematic portions. I'll start with the first one. The criminality dissent should be the first argument you make against these type of statements or assumptions that people will make, that caging people is okay. That caging people okay doesn't assume the fact that Black people are policed at a higher rate than white people. and they receive harsher sentencing for the same crime as white people. Remember, if they can't prove that law is just, how do you prove the punishment is just? The second one is a value dissent. The concept of paying your debt is a form of slave technology. It's a tool that's used to perpetuate constant bondage. That there is a debt that you have accumulated because of the way that you act or the things that you've done. And it's very interesting that that particular debt is ascribed to poor people, which is why we have the war on poverty dissent. Justice isn't just unless you are paid. Breaking the law does not mean jail time. Being poor actually means going to jail time. An example I'm going to give you is, if you remember a couple of years ago, there was a young man who was driving his car. I believe he was drunk at the time. He hit someone and killed them. He went to court. His lawyer argued that he suffered from a mental condition known as affluenza. Affluenza, in which his parents never held him accountable for anything. They always would pay and make it go away. And the case was dismissed. He won. He won that because he was rich and his parents never punished him or trained him not to do things, that he couldn't be held responsible for killing a person when he was a drunk driver. Our system doesn't punish criminals. It punishes minorities and poor people. And it's built to work that way. So when someone says caging humans is okay, that if you do a crime, you should be punished, they're working on an assumption that legality and criminality at the end of the day operate across the board the same. They don't. They're not equal. They actually work structurally different based on your race, your gender, and not most importantly, but very importantly, your economics. Can you afford an attorney, or will you get a public defender? I think a very interesting concept that I don't know if we've talked about yet, and I'm sorry, this is a slight tangent, just hang in there. The concept of plea deals and how violent they are. Public defenders have way too many cases, and that's due to overpopulation and the over-sentencing, or way too many people kind of being locked up for insignificant things. So they get plea deals out, like Skittles, which naturally means that several people are in jail or awaiting a trial because of plea deals and because of the system that uses those things. So, is punishing people by putting them in cages good? I would say no. So when we say abolition, what do we really mean? Well, when we say abolition, I believe we mean changing the landscape of the conversation. That we have to create a condition to decrease the demand for police and for surveillance. That we need to increase the way that we have health and human services around jobs, drug addiction, housing, and how people need structure to move back towards a place of comfort and safety. I think the other thing we're talking about is the difference between equity and equality. Third, I think it's a discussion of punitive justice versus restorative justice. Several people want justice to mean that other people suffer because they are suffering at that time. Think about that for a second. People are willing to maintain a cycle of violence because they believe that either that'll make them feel better or it somehow heals the hurt, or that is the debt to be paid by an individual. But it doesn't do that. The last thing is that we have to drastically rethink crime, and policing. And what does that mean? What does it mean to commit a crime? And what does it mean for individuals to be police or to police an area? Like I said, we all break the law, probably on a daily basis doing something. I don't know what, but it's possible. Some of us are more fortunate than others because we can just simply move as if that law does not apply to us. Some of us aren't that lucky. I think the alternative wants to pose a scenario of imagining a world beyond criminality, economic exploitation, and social stratification. Criminality says that certain groups of people are not trustworthy. They're always dangerous. Economic exploitation means that because you cannot get a proper attorney, that you have to accept a plea deal, or you have to sit in prison, or you lose the case because your attorney doesn't care. Or even worse, you go to jail because you can't pay parking tickets. Social stratification is all about how there are parts of our society, people that are struggling with illnesses, drug addiction, alcohol addiction, that we police instead of helping them. I think the alternative calls for us to challenge the assumption that there are always groups of people that we need to be fearful of, that we need to be worried about. And instead begin to have conversation about what safety actually means in the context of people. It's not about punitive justice. It's about restoring people back into humanity, thinking about their relationship to the world and how we orient that. The last thing I want to talk about, and I'll kind of get through this quickly, we can spend more time talking about this in the discussion portion after you all watch these videos, is non-traditional debate. It's growing rapidly, and it's here. It's been here, and it's going to stay. So what is it? Well, generally speaking, when I say non-traditional debate, I mean performance as debate. And before you say, oh, performance, oh, I hate performance, everyone performs. Your speech act in and of itself is a performance. I'm talking about people who like to use different modes of communication to do that, whether it is rapping or poetry or music, or even if it is, humorously reading a text in a debate. All of these are kind of great models. The second portion is that it is sometimes about a theoretical investigation as a debate. So you read a theory, you want to have a discussion about that theory, and you're not too concerned about the resolution. But you are concerned about how that theory shows itself through kind of whether it's debate acts, through the resolution, whatever else. The last part is, I would say, accountability as debate. When some people make some arguments, other people may not like them. Some people say that, non-Black debaters should not read anti-Blackness. And I think that there are portions of anti-Blackness that's problematic for them to read. I think talking about kind of Black death and really focusing on the impact portions of it is weird. There's some tension. But I do think there are ways that you can read the theoretical investigation and it be extremely effective and also not as cringeworthy. So accountability as debate is also about thinking about what your performance does. Think about how you interact with people. Because again, what's your relation to the world around you? What's your relation to debate? If you haven't thought about that and you run into a team that all they've spent is time thinking about how people relate to debate, how people relate to the world, that's going to be a very stressful debate. So having that thought process now may help with figuring out the best way to begin to have those conversations, the best way to begin challenging assumptions that you have about what accountability is actually about and about what they're saying it is. Today, I've identified the K. We've kind of defined some critique terms. We've looked at some critical applications, which is to identify different Ks. We talked about the abolition K, and we also talked about non-traditional debate. And this concludes part 2 of the critique lecture. Thank you.